Hello, it's John from the Christian Century, and I'm joined today by one of our Voices columnists, Brian Bantum. Brian recently wrote a piece for the magazine called Can Dead Things Live Again? So we are going to talk about that piece and the themes. But first, Brian, hello. For those of us who don't know you, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hey, John. So my name is Dr. Brian Bantum. I'm the Neil F. and Isla A. Fisher Professor of Theology at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. Um, I've written a couple books on race, and most recently a book on marriage with my partner, Reverend Gail Song Bantum. And I teach and think and write around questions of identity, um, and race, gender, but also general spirituality, and what it means to live and participate in God's life.
Oh, that's great. Well, I'm really glad we could chat today, so thanks for joining us. Um, so this essay raises a lot of interesting questions and thoughts in a short time. In the beginning of the essay, you talk about our society being so demystified and how we don't want to call things blessings, like getting a check in the mail. It's hard to call that a blessing when we know someone else who didn't get a check in the mail, who can't pay their bills. And yet, if we remove God from the equation of everything, it feels confining. It feels like we're trapped in kind of a naturalistic world. And you call this sort of dilemma a knot, K-N-O-T. The question of how God moves in the little things. And I'm just curious if you could share with us a little bit of your thoughts about untying that knot or making sense of it, or how you try to approach answering that question.
Yeah, thanks. And I appreciate. I'm so glad that you feel like the article was intriguing. So that's always the hope. Um, yeah, I guess the this question that has kind of always kind of come up. I mean, especially when you teach theology, there's questions of theodicy. Why does evil exist? Um, and I really got exposed to notions of miracles in a real visceral way, actually through my spouse, who is Pentecostal, and kind of getting exposed to her tradition, to her church. Um, it was through those moments that I started to become deeply aware of the possibility that there was something more than me dwelling in me in some ways. I had been raised, or I come to Christ as in a good Southern Baptist church, and and even something like tongues, that was God. They were really about use, right? God used miracles more for pedagogy, right, to kind of prove a point, rather than to really invite something in. And I think through kind of exposure to my partner's life, that's then created some opportunities for me to really, there was just a real sense of kind of supernatural presence, like something that I could not explain apart from um, God being with me. It kind of becomes the question, okay, well, how do you then begin to account for all of these other things in the world? And but I'm not necessarily a person who has all these supernatural experiences all the time. They are just really two or three instances in my life that are kind of these pointers. But then it became a question of like, well, then how do I account for this more than me every day? And interesting enough, the more I actually kind of got into the arts and allowed my own kind of artistic side, my own habits and practices of creative writing, I began to embrace those. You actually begin to see so much mystery in the world, the kind of miraculous in these kind of small ways. Um, and I think in this way, like what I started to realize is the miraculous is always begins with the acknowledgement of what you don't know. Um, but at the same time, the acknowledgement that there is something there, right? So there's a way of saying that, like, oh, I don't know, so therefore let me just put it in a closet and just attend to the things that I can materially control or understand. There's something else when you say I don't know, and yet I also know. And to me, that's the kind of substance of faith. And so when I start looking at the world through the lens of poetry or visual arts, all of a sudden you kind of start to see this really beautiful kind of dance that's always happening in terms of what you know and what you don't know, of what's there and what's not there. Um, and beginning to turn to that and see the relationality that's all of it. That's not just head knowledge of what I know and what I don't know. It's much more of a bodied knowing, and being known. And so once you start to attend to that, you start to realize, oh, wait a second, there is so much even about myself that I don't know. And I think especially, and this is kind of what I think when I'm thinking about this kind of demystified world, I think we're really afraid of that. I think we're afraid to admit that there's are things about our own body, our own psyche, our own soul, our own hopes and dreams and worries that at the end of the day, we really have no idea. We wake up in the morning, we're really pissed for some reason, and it's going to take some time to figure out why. We wake up another morning, we're really happy, and we could try to like analyze what we ate before dinner or whether or not I had a walk. But at the end of the day, it's a little bit of a mystery, and I think that scares us all the time. And so, living in a demystified world is much easier because it feels like we can control those things to what we know and what we can determine. Um, so I think that it's really kind of two sides of there's a couple of reasons why we demystify, partly because we are afraid of the not knowing, but I think then we're also afraid of trying to account for what's good in our life, in ways that are sometimes painful.
Wow. Yeah. A lot to think about. I'm excited to reflect on my own story, my own engagements with Southern Baptist tradition and Pentecostal tradition, and how those have shaped me and my interpretations of myself and the world. So thank you. Um, Moving on in this essay a bit, largely this piece is reflecting on a story in Luke 7, Jesus giving back from the dead, the son of a widow. And you mentioned that when you read these gospel stories, you're often just fixated on like the biological. And whereas the widow in the story is surely thinking about the relational. She's thinking about her son being restored to her. And so I'm curious, just why do you think we are so easily drawn to think about just the literal biological facts of a miracle story rather than what they're probably trying to point us toward or signify?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it kind of comes back to this reality of our kind of craving for certainty, things that can be measured. Even for myself, as a teacher and an artist, so much of the work that I do is kind of unfinished, and you're almost always staring at something unfinished. A student's understanding, a written word, and then when it's finally done, you're just by nature already moving on to the next thing, and so and it never really feels really finished. So one of my practices almost always, especially at the end of the school years, has always been to build something. Um, Build some bookshelves, build a patio, do a walkway, do something like very physical, very tangible, has a start and a finish. And I think we as human beings are kind of always drawn to those things. I mean, I think that if you look at the explosion of self-help books versus poetry books, for example, I think this is part of it. Like we want concrete things. And so the miracles, when we look at the miracles, it feels cut and dry, right? There was a person who was dead and now they're alive. There was a person who was sick, and could not walk, and now they're walking. And I think part of it though is that I don't want to diminish those realities, because I think for a lot of us, we have those very tangible things in our lives that we want turned around, that we feel like there's a miracle that's possible. We yearn for something like that, in our lives. Um, but I think sometimes what happens to us is we think that if that thing can get turned around, if the disease can go away, if the sun can get returned, everything will be fine. Um, and I think when we start to get past that reality, then all of a sudden we have to kind of confront the possibilities that there are much more uncertain things in our life that we have to wrestle with. And that the relationship that we have to the land, to one another, to our child, are always much more complicated. One of the things I started thinking a little bit about as I was thinking about this piece was as much as the was, how many days before the mother and the son got into a fight after this, like, because surely it wasn't, all, daisies and ponies, right? Like how long before the son like didn't clean up after himself, like he'd done for like years and years before, and the mother just gets pissed and like, you always do this, however you're thinking about me, like him being raised for the dead doesn't change that. And I think when we start thinking about the patterns of everyday life and relationship as being um, difficult and a struggle in lots of ways. That all of those daily lives that we have are themselves kind of embedded and imbued with this knowing and not knowing, um, of that there is this relationship in my life, and yet at the same time there's something that I will never know or will continue to have to know about these people in my life, these people in my community, and I can't not be without them. And yet at the same time, I'm going to always be faced by what I don't know, by the disagreements, by the difference over and over and over again. Um, I think that just short circuits some of our brains a little bit. So we could just say, let's just focus on the death and the not dead. That would be great. And I think we miss out on life with God when we actually reduce God's life with us to a series of miracles, including the cross, including resurrection.
Yeah. Wow. Near the end of the piece, you kind of leave us with this idea. You say that reflecting on this story makes you think about, quote, the ways God has raised things in my life I thought long dead. I wonder if you could tell us a little more about this. What sort of things did you have in mind when you wrote that? And what does it mean for God to raise those things from the dead?
Yeah. Well, I think I mean, there's a lot of examples in my own life. I mean, I think one that's farther back is my own relationship with my father. Um, he was an alcoholic. Wasn't he and my mom were best friends, but also he wasn't great to my mom in lots of ways. I was not a fan at all. And then eventually, but when I was 15, we found out he had cancer. Um, he had become a Christian. So I followed him to church. That actually was part of my own kind of conversion. Um, and I had like this really beautiful testimony about how our relationship got restored, and through his illness, I came to into the church and faith. But it was actually a number of years later when I was getting ready to have my first, we found out we were pregnant with our first child. And I was young. I got married when I was 21, our first child when we were 23. So we're babies, really. Um, and I realized I suddenly had like this deep, profound fear. Like I thought all I wanted to be was a father. But then once confronted with the reality of being a father, I had this profound fear that I was going to be a father the way my father was. Um, and had this recognition of these patterns in my life that as much as I disliked him and was frustrated with him, I saw them repeating in my own life. Um, and and so part of the kind of gift of and I mean, in an ironic kind of twist, like I ended up having three sons. Um, and with each one of them, I was confronted with the possibility of a kind of resurrection, um, of realizing that my father was in fact living in me and through me. And in the possibility of a restoration and a possibility of being a kind of father to my kids that my father wasn't to me, but also being a kind of father to my kids that my father was to me, in all the beautiful ways, that there is something coming alive again there. Um, And I think that's miraculous, because it's not like I made a list of like these are all the things that I need to make sure that I do to improve myself as a father. They really were these kinds of moments of my eyes opening and becoming aware of a kind of presence in my life that I'm still trying to figure out and still trying to understand and live into. So that's a big one for me. Like I think that's miraculous. I think that's every time I think about my kids, and they're all adults now, so they've lived longer with their father than I had lived with my father, um, and every single year is a gift, and I just kind of sit back and wonder at what that life is like. So that's one, and then I would say like another more recent one is, and it's not like world changing or anything, but it is for me. And when I was, all growing up, I was kind of an artsy kid, an insular kid, and I was drawing and writing poems and all this. But then interestingly enough, when I got called to ministry, I stopped all that because that's not what ministry was about. Ministry was about church history and learning the Bible and theology. And so that kind of led me on this path eventually to becoming a theologian. And I would say about 7 or 8 years ago, just through a series of weird circumstances, again, things that you can't control, no. I was kind of good, I got drawn back into creative writing and ended up going to this creative writing workshop. Over the course of the week, we're writing a short story for the first time. This has been the first time I had written a short story in like 15 years or so. And I'm sitting there writing, and it's 11 o'clock at night, and I'm just like, as I'm like typing this thing into the computer, I'm just bawling. Like I'm just like hoping, I'm just trying to make sure that my computer doesn't short out because that I don't drench it. And the next morning I woke up and I realized I I had never felt so connected to something that I wrote, and that I had shut off something in myself, thinking that I was following God, thinking that I was following what this call meant, but in fact had not actually acknowledged, brought my whole self. Um, and so in that moment, there really was a sense that God was giving a part of myself back to me, um, saying that your writing, the way you see the world is as important to the work as the scholarly articles, as the teaching, as the XYZ. Um, and so in that way, like what I feel like God was kind of giving back to me was not just a kind of love of something, but really was showing me that I had not been living whole for so long, and it was an invitation to live a whole life, and I've been struggling to to figure out what that means. Again, it's like it's not one of those things where I just wake up and say, "Oh, great, this is awesome. Let me just move in." So for 7 years, it's kind of these stumbling steps to figure out what that whole life could look like, but knowing that it's out there, like knowing that it's in me, and wanting to participate in it, to say yes to God in that moment, to receive it, and every day as much as I can.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing both of those stories with us. They are moving and rich, and it's a gift. So thank you for sharing part of yourself with us today. Um, those of you out there who have not yet gotten the chance to read the article, Can Dead Things Live Again? The link will be below in the video description where you can go read that article. We'll also put in there the link to Brian's website with his spouse where you can go read the book on marriage that they've written called Choosing Us and learn more about them and some of their other writings. Brian, thank you so much for chatting today.
Thanks, John. It's been fun.